So take it away, if you wish. Stephan Kappler, who is a psychologist and priest of the Diocese of Oakland, California, but originally from Munich, Germany. Yes. Yeah, so common. He is, currently serves as president and chief of psychologist of the Southdown Institute, which is a mental health provider of preventative and restorative services for clergy and religious and lay ecclesial ministers in Toronto, Canada. He serves also on the Standing Committee for the Protection of Minors and Responsible Ministry of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, and has published on mental health and boundary issues within the church context. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind words. Good afternoon, everyone. And I know everybody's hungry, so I'm going to try to do this quite efficiently here. But I just want to say, for those of you that have ever done a poster session, this is quite a luxury to be able to speak to all of you, because you usually stand with your poster somewhere and have people like, come and see the poster, right? So this is a great luxury to be able to present this to all of you in this fashion. So I would like to briefly talk to you, just giving you some highlights of a study that we published in the APA peer-reviewed Journal of Spirituality and Clinical Practice. It's a 2020 publication, actually, but I wanted to give you some of the highlights that really pertain to our topic of accountability. So for more of the details of the study, I'd tell you, look at the actual publication in the journal. But for today, I'd like to talk to you about the shift that we have been observing, right? So Southdown Institute is a Canadian mental health center, mainly for clergy and religious and lay ecclesia, lay pastoral ministers. But a big part of our work is not just treatment, but also preventative work, right? So we go into human formation in some of the seminaries, talk to different clergy gatherings, etc., about preventative work, especially around the issue of boundaries. There's been a real shift that we have seen in the various centers. While the majority of clergy and vowed religious who are referred to treatment centers, they're referred for, not for issues related to boundaries, right? So I just want to make that clear. Most clergy and religious that get referred for things such as traumatic distress in their lives, right? Depression, anxiety, exhaustion, addictive, maladaptive behaviors, maybe a lot of interpersonal difficulties. For those of you from religious communities, many times, right, you might have a member where, you know, for years and years, there's some recurring difficulties, maybe in relating to others, etc. So those are the main reasons why people get referred to treatment centers. Or maybe the person has a vocational crisis. However, what we are seeing over the last 10 years is a real shift in terms of referrals. Clearly, none of the centers, neither in the United States nor us in Canada, have seen any referrals for someone for abuse of a minor. Now, I think a big part of why we're not seeing those referrals any longer is because of all the work that's been done in safeguarding, right? So, I mean, I do want to make that correlation that the work that has been done in safeguarding, I think, has really brought a level of protection and awareness, right, where we're now seeing a lot less referrals. I don't want to be naive and say that abuse of minors from clergy is no longer happening, but we're not seeing those referrals. One of the reasons also why we're not seeing the referrals is that many of the centers, including us, we would not accept a referral for abuse of a minor, simply because, like in my case, we don't have a forensic psychologist. We're not a forensic psychology center, because that's a very specialized form of treatment, right? However, what we are seeing, the number one reason for referral today, the number one reason for referral of a priest today, is boundary violation with a vulnerable adult or an adult in a vulnerable situation. There's a whole debate about what do we mean by vulnerability, right? And that's the first thing that I would like to highlight, because I think it is a challenge. I would like to pose it as a challenge for all of us in safeguarding. While we have a global understanding and a real global consensus of why abuse of a minor is clearly recognized, right? Globally. Yet there is a lack of clarity when it comes to who and what constitutes a vulnerable person. I can tell you I get 6 phone calls, let's say 6 bishops call me about a case, and I get 6 different definitions of is this a vulnerable person or not. So from the one extreme, I might get a bishop who says, oh no, these are 2 consenting adults. Are they? I'm going to get into some cases, right? So on the one hand, we have bishops and superiors who might look at this in a very relaxed manner, really misunderstanding power differentials. And then on the other extreme, you have bishops who are really zero tolerance in terms of, this is a vulnerable adult, and I have already begun a canonical process. So it spans the gamut. There's a lack of clarity. I think Pope Francis has really helped the process by Vos Estis Lux Mundi, right? Because for the first time, really now we have, yes, minors. Any person under the age of 18, equivalent to a minor, is a person who habitually has imperfect use of reason. But then the second one, vulnerable adult, is added, right? Any person in a state of infirmity, physical or mental deficiency, or, this is important, deprivation of personal liberty, which in fact even occasionally limits that person's understanding to resist the offense. So the question is, who can give consent? We understand and agree globally that a minor cannot give informed, free consent. We are taking at Southdown the perspective really from the mental health field, because in the mental health community, I think we have learned to define who is a vulnerable person when we look at the power imbalance that exists, right? So in the mental health setting, for example, there's clarity that between a client and a mental health provider, there can never be meaningful consent. Never. Because of the inherent power imbalance, right? So we always know that the psychotherapist, the psychologist, the doctor, to go back to the earlier presentations, right, the medical doctor, that the person providing care has the fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the client, and it is the duty of the practitioner to maintain the boundaries. And many times in clergy, we see that that understanding is lacking, right? Where we hear sort of like the story, oh, no, she wanted this also. He wanted this also. This was a mutual thing, right? So that clarity of understanding is not there. So the way we see vulnerability at Southdown, we've tried to define it as, yes, it's an adult of diminished capacity to consent due to age, illness, disability, yes, but also an adult in crisis who's coming to us seeking pastoral, spiritual, or emotional support. An adult who relies upon another person for emotional, psychological, physical, spiritual care support. But let's go further. We also say it's an adult in a context of what we call a positional power imbalance, right? So in other words, if I'm the priest, my parishioner, a staff member, a ministry recipient, a spiritual directee, a pastoral counselee, a seminarian, a supervisee, right? So any person but positionally is relying on me to maintain the boundaries. Also, we would say it's an adult in a context of personal power imbalance, right? So this means, for example, if we are dealing with somebody who might be in a position right now in the context of maybe poverty or financial dependence, or is going through a crisis of anxiety, depression, trauma, etc. So that person would be in a personal power imbalance. Finally, a person in a spiritual power imbalance. And that's important because we have seen many abuses of confession or spiritual direction, right? So when the person comes to seek spiritual advice, that person is in a spiritual power imbalance. Finally, the last one I would like to add to it, and some people think that goes too far, but I don't think so, and that means any adult who sought safety in the ministerial role of the priest. And that person may not even be a Catholic, but they may have come to the rectory, ringing the bell, because they were seeking safety in the role of the priest. Right? So, what did we identify as the risk factors? There are 4 risk factors, and I'm going to go through them quickly. Underdeveloped affective maturity, unintegrated psychosexual identity, spiritual rigidity, and poor understanding of boundaries. I'm going to address each one really quickly. So these are the risk factors that we have observed in more than 600 priests that have been treated at Southdown, and these are, you know, sort of like archival research, and we looked at the combining factors, and these were identified at all of them to put people at risk. First, underdeveloped affective maturity, basically that's a term, right, we use a lot now. It basically, in the psychological world, that really is a term that doesn't exist. The term that exists in the psychological literature would be emotional competence or emotional intelligence. So what we see as risk factors is when a person has limited insight or understanding of their own relational needs. When a person has an over-reliance on somebody else setting the boundaries for me. When there's an overly simplistic external focus of boundaries, and sometimes we see that impending trouble gets intellectualized or spiritualized. Now that often gets compounded, right, when somebody has very little understanding of their own emotional life and their own emotional needs. It gets compounded by the unearned privilege of clergy members, also known as clericalism, right? Because ordained males, I don't need to tell you, in a male-dominated hierarchical power structure. So sometimes that amplifies, right, that limited understanding of power dynamics. Think about it. Our priests spend many, many years, many times in an all-male, highly structured, at times emotionally restrictive and socially isolated environment. And I'm referring to many seminaries, for example, in the United States. When I was at seminary in Munich, it was a little different because we attended university at the Ludwig Maximilians University. We walked down the street, we were there with the lay students, men, women, everybody together. Many seminaries in the United States are, as one of the professors earlier said, are a bubble. Because for 8 years, pretty much, you're in your bubble. That doesn't promote, often, a growth in emotional maturity. Also, there's generations of priests, for example, in the United States, that grew up with sort of like this fear of particular friendships. That was a thing, I can tell you that generations of priests were told that. No particular friendships. What many of them took away from that was no friendships. There's lots of priests who would tell us when they come to treatment that they never learned how to really develop a good male, intimate peer relationship or a good, intimate, male-female relationship as a friendship. Okay, so these things are the other one that's there as a real risk factor is an increasing sense of loneliness and isolation. We just did a study which we published last year, peer-reviewed also, on the impact of COVID-19 on priests across Canada. Depression was one of the major factors. The second one, loneliness. Loneliness, increasing demands on priests. Many of the rural areas in Canada, you would have priests living by themselves, driving for 2-3 hours sometimes to get to the next person. in very isolated situations, right? So loneliness is quite a factor. And then also, give you an example, I did a clergy workshop in a rural diocese in Saskatchewan in Canada. All diocesan priests were present, 65 of them. Of the 65, 4 were Canadian-born. 4 priests were Canadian-born. So that's a reality that you have in a lot of places in Canada, United States, where we have a lot of priests coming from other parts of the world, meaning cultural differences are coming to play. And many times topics such as boundaries has so many cultural nuances, right? And many times the priests are not being very much helped because there's not a lot of help and aid given in terms of acculturation and wrapping your mind around things. I'm running out of time. See, I said I'm going to be fast, and I'm not. Okay, thank you. So, unintegrated psychosexual identity, basically meaning a lot of priests that we encounter have many times, and I'm not exaggerating, never or rarely dealt with their sexuality. Open conversations about sexuality, coming to terms with your own sexual needs, your own sexual identity, your own sexual preferences, etc. Many times has been a taboo in the family to talk about it, and many times that taboo has been perpetrated and continued in the seminary. Many times also priests have not explored their own sexual trauma, maybe. It's not actually the number of priests and religious that are survivors of sexual trauma themselves is a higher percentage than the rest of the population. Okay, I'm going to have to jump through this. Sometimes scrupulous beliefs are there. Sometimes there's a judgmental and sinful approach to sexuality, right? Because we are not really given a lot of alternatives to look at our sexuality in a more grace-filled, gift-related manner. The fourth issue was the third one was spiritual rigidity, and for those of you that are in touch with priests and seminarians today, you probably can echo that, right? There is sort of like a recurring thing that we're seeing a lot where there's a bit of a spiritual rigidity that we're seeing. Sometimes there's a lot of judgment, self-judgment that's going on. Perfectionism, another very strong one, right? Good leaders are usually perfectionists because that makes us pushing forward, but also comes at a high cost. So we see that a lot also in some of the priests, and that is a risk factor. Finally, spiritual bypassing, another big one, right? Where instead of looking at an issue, people bypass it and come up with some, maybe I go to my spiritual director to this, or I go to confession about this, and unfortunately then it becomes a revolving door, because instead of looking at what's happening, I confess it, but I don't really analyze it and reflect on it critically. Okay, poor understanding of boundaries. I'm going to finish with this. Many times there is a real difficulty seeing what I call the process of boundary violations. Many times something begins in a very innocent manner, where maybe a person has a good connection to their youth minister, and then that good connection kind of unconsciously develops into spending more and more time, spending your day off regularly, losing sight of the power imbalance, and then boom, all of a sudden you have a situation where things have gone sideways and we have a boundary violation. Where do we go from here? Last slide. I think we need to look at the area of what is vulnerability. I think actually for us that would be a really important thing, because that definition of what makes a person vulnerable, right? How do we define that? I think we also need to look at power imbalances, and as we said earlier, ongoing human formation is a big area, because I can tell you as a priest, I find it shameful sometimes. As a psychologist, every year I have to renew my license. And every year I have to prove that I have studied, that I'm up to speed on the newest research, that I have educated myself as a priest. And next year it's 30 years as a priest. If I had not once picked up a book or a research article, nobody would care. So, ongoing formation. And I know priests are hungry for that and are asking for that. I think we should offer that. And I think also moving formation into smaller circles, so it's not becoming just sitting there at a clergy meeting where you check out and basically double multitask and check your phone, right? Instead of information, processing information in small groups so people can really internalize it and grasp it. Sorry I went over time. Thank you.